Young Fu practice is definitely on. Okay, so having not agreed in advance on a specific topic for tonight, what I decided to do was to bring to your attention a few uh, daily mails, which I receive from the Carl Jung Depth Psychology site blog. Now, an example of these is here, and I receive these every day. And below this video screen, you'll see a link to that blog site. I urge you to follow it and follow their, ask for their emails, because every day, Louis LaFontaine, my friend, puts new Jung quotes on email to me, and it gives me the opportunity to read those. And often they're very useful to me in terms of my thinking. Anyway, so this evening I'm going to begin with one of these emails from Lewis, which is called Carl Jung on the Christian Message. And this is in the form of a letter to Pastor W. Niederer, which was written on October the 1st, 1953. And Dr. Jung this letter also appears in volume 2 of Letters of C.G. Jung. And so in this letter, Pastor Niederer raised 4 points. And so what I'm going to do is tell you what each point was and then how Dr. Jung responded to it. The point number 1, Jung's intention to make the biblical message intelligible to modern people. And so Dr. Jung says, I will answer your points as best I can in writing. 1, my interest in the first place was to understand the message of the Christian message myself. My interest in the first place was to understand the meaning of the Christian message myself. In the second place, to convey this understanding to those of my patients who felt a religious need. And in the third place, to salvage the meaning of Christian symbols in general. Point 2. His critics' conviction that he depersonalized God and made similar misunderstandings. Dr. Jung's response. 2. I don't do anything to God at all. How could I? Sometimes it just cracks me up. I criticize merely our conceptions of God. I have no idea what God is in himself. In my experience, there are only psychic phenomena, which are ultimately of unknown origin, since the psyche in itself is hopelessly unconscious. My critics all ignore the epistemological barrier, which is expressly respected by me. Okay, epistemology is the science of studying the beginnings of philosophy and so on. So Dr. Jung here is referring to his statement that he never says anything about the metaphysical God. Just as everything we perceive is a psychic phenomenon and therefore secondary, so is all inner experience. We should be truly modest and not imagine we can say anything about God himself. Truly, we are confronted with frightful enigmas. We must, in fact, be conscious that an unconscious exists. I don't dare to formulate what the theologian does, but what I do is try to make people conscious enough to know where they can exercise their will and where they are confronted with the power of a non-ego. So far as I can observe the workings of this non-ego, it is possible for me to make statements about it. I have no real cognitive means, only arbitrary decisions, which would enable me to distinguish the unknowable non-ego from what men since the remotest times have called God or gods, etc. For instance, so far as I can supreme let's see if I can get this better in the book, because it seems we have an error here. So far as I can observe the workings of this non-ego, it is possible for me to make statements about it. I have no real cognitive means, only arbitrary decisions, which would enable me to distinguish the unknowable non-ego from what men since the remotest times have called God or gods, etc. For instance, the, so far as I can judge, supreme archetype of the self has a symbolism identical with the traditional Christ in God image. For instance, the supreme archetype of the self has a symbolism identical with the traditional Christian God image. How all this can be understood without a knowledge of the psychology of the unconscious or without self-knowledge is utterly beyond me. In psychology, one understands only what one has experienced. The archetype is the ultimate I can know of the inner world. This knowledge denies nothing. This knowledge denies nothing else that might be there. Okay, so those are his first 2 points in this letter. I will look back and see if there are any comments and then move on. Hi, Dan, how are you? Okay, so now going on, since I see no comments to that part of the letter, I'll go on and read these additional points. And let me see, point 3, the problem of the archetype in relation to God's power. Okay, so that's what Pastor Nieder had raised. 3, if one assumes that God affects the psychic background and activates it or actually is it, then the archetypes are, so to speak, organs or tools of God. The self functions like the Christ image. This is the theological Christus in nobis. And I did have a translation of that. Christus in nobis means Christ among us. And so I'll reread that bit. The self functions like the Christ image. This is the theological Christus in nobis, Christ in ourselves. It is not only I who think this way, but all of the ancients right back to Paul. I take my stand clearly on the empirical plane and speak a psychological language, where the theologian speaks an analogous theological or mythological language. Of course, theological statements about the Christian eon do not agree at all points with psychological empiricism. For instance, in regard to God as the summum bonum, or Christ as a one-sided pneumatic light figure. But everything that is alive changes. It even develops, so that Christianity is no longer what it was, let alone, let's see. This is also messed up on this. It even develops so that Christianity is no longer what it was 1,000, let alone 1,900 years ago. It can differentiate itself still further, i.e., go on living, but to do that, it must be interpreted anew in every eon. If that does not happen, it happens even in the Catholic Church, it suffocates in traditionalism. But the foundations, the fundamental psychic facts, remain eternally the same. And going on. So the point 4, the condemnation of Jung as an a-Christian psychologist of religion by certain narrow-minded theologians. That's the reference. So Jung says, point 4, here I can only say, O sancta simplicitas, I realize I am fit for the stake ad malorum dea gloriam. I consider myself a Christian, but that didn't do Savonarola or Servetus much good, and not even Christ himself escaped this fate. Woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. How about these parsons and the true imitatio Christi? How about these parsons and the true imitatio Christi? Where are they crucified? They are redeemed scot-free of all pain, and Christ can take care of everything else. And then, with respects to your wife and kind regards, yours sincerely, C.G. Jung. So that's the first letter, and I'll welcome any comments you may have. And then I'll go on to another topic. Nothing seems to be emerging, so everybody is flashbanged by that one. And so I'm going to go on to Carl Jung's opinion on astrology. That should be popular. And this appears in volume 1 of the letters, page 475. And Lewis has put a meme on this letter which says, synchronous events are widely accepted in Chinese philosophy and are the basis of astrology. And that's from Carl Jung, Conversations with C.G. Jung, page 51. Okay. So Dr. Jung is responding to a letter that came from Mr. B.V. Raman, Raman Publications, proprietor B.V. Raman, the astrological magazine, India's leading cultural monthly. Okay, so he was responding to an Indian astrological magazine. And this letter is dated September 6th, 1947. And so people often ask about astrology with respect to Dr. Jung's work. And so I thought this would interest you. Dear Professor Raman, I haven't yet received the astrological magazine, but I will answer your letter nonetheless. Since you want to know my opinion about astrology, I can tell you that I've been interested in this particular activity of the human mind for more than 30 years. As I am a psychologist, I'm chiefly interested in the particular light the horoscope sheds on certain complications in the character. In cases of difficult psychological diagnosis, I usually get a horoscope in order to have a further point of view from an entirely different angle. I must say that I very often found that the astrological data elucidated certain points which I otherwise would have been unable to understand. From such experiences, I formed the opinion that astrology is of particular interest to the psychologist, since it contains a sort of psychological experience which we call projected. This means that we find the psychological facts, as it were, in the constellations. This originally gave rise to the idea that these factors derive from the stars, whereas they are merely in a relation of synchronicity with them. I admit that this is a very curious fact which throws a peculiar light on the structure of the human mind. What I miss in astrological literature is chiefly the statistical method by which certain fundamental facts can be scientifically established. Hoping that this answer meets your request, I remain yours sincerely, C.G. Jung. So that should give you something to talk about or comment on. What Dr. Jung is basically saying is that, like other divination methods, astrology works with synchronicities, and synchronicities relate to hooks that are in your psyche, where your psyche is ready for something to happen, and then something does happen, and you say, aha, that's connected, which it isn't necessarily causally connected, but people from time immemorial have considered that it was. So, somebody can take astrology and do some statistics on it. That would be interesting to see what came out of that. Certainly what Dr. Jung observed over a long period of time is that ideas were projected into astrology, and when that happens over a long period of time, it comes closer and closer to what everybody knows. So, for example, in the Chinese zodiac, the Chinese have an animal associated with each year. And if you go into a Chinese restaurant and get one of those placemats that has the 12 years and what they are on them, you often will find that they are uncanny and they're very close to your actual character. Now, I don't think anybody really knows how that came together. It came together over thousands of years, but it nonetheless has truth to it. And so I've always thought that anyway. And yes, Thomas, I agree with you that the images of the various horoscopes and constellations are useful to study as symbols. But I guess the question is, symbols of what? What are they symbols of? That's the big question. Okay. Working right through my material tonight. Okay, there's a letter to a Reverend Morton T. Kelsey. Reverend Morton T. Kelsey. Reverend Kelsey was the rector of St. Luke's Episcopal Church, Monrovia, near Los Angeles, California, and he wrote a highly appreciative letter about Answer to Job. How can I thank you enough for this book? It has served as a catalyst enabling a fusion to take place between my theological thinking and the experience of life which my analytical work has stimulated. So the Reverend Kelsey, I believe, was also a Jungian analyst. And so when he read Answer to Job, which came out in real time during his lifetime and Dr. Jung's, it allowed his theological thinking and his analytical thinking to run together. And I think if you look onto Amazon, you can find at least one book I know is there of the Reverend Morton T. Kelsey. But in any case, I'm going to read this letter that Dr. Jung wrote on 3 May 1958. And Thomas says, James Hillman's son Lawrence has delved into astrology, Ray Jungian psychology. YouTube videos exist. Okay, I'll look into that, Thomas, when time permits. Though the images of the various yep, okay. Symbols of types, I suppose. Yeah, maybe. Okay, so moving on to the Reverend Morton T. Kelsey. Thank you very much for your kind letter. I appreciate it. I appreciate it indeed, since it is the first and only one I got from a Protestant theologian in the U.S.A. who has read Job. I can't help feeling that I am beneath consideration. All the more I value your kind effort to write to me. The psychology of the book of Job seems to be of the highest importance concerning the inner motivation of Christianity. The fact that none, as far as I am able to see, of the existing commentaries has drawn the necessary conclusions has long since been a cause of wonder to me. Occasional outbursts of short-sighted wrath didn't surprise me. The almost total apathy and indifference of the theologians was more astonishing. As you realize, I am discussing the admittedly anthropomorphic image of Yahweh, and I do not apply metaphysical judgments. From this methodological standpoint, I gain the necessary freedom of criticism. The absence of human morality in Yahweh is a stumbling block which cannot be overlooked, as little as the fact that nature, i.e. God's creation, does not give us enough reason to believe it to be purposive or reasonable in the human sense. We miss reason and moral values, that is, two main characteristics of a mature human mind. It is therefore obvious that the Yahwistic image or conception of the deity is less than that of certain human specimens. The image of a personified brutal force and of an unethical and non-spiritual mind, yet inconsistent enough to exhibit traits of kindness and generosity, besides a violent power drive. It is the picture of a sort of nature demon, and at the same time of a primitive chieftain aggrandized to a colossal size. Just the sort of conception one could expect of a more or less barbarous society. He says, cum grano salis, which means with a grain of salt. This image owes its existence certainly not to an invention or intellectual formulation, but rather to a spontaneous manifestation, i.e. to religious experience of men like Samuel and Job, and thus it retains its validity to this day. People still ask, is it possible that God allows such things? Even the Christian God may be asked, why do you let your only Son suffer for the imperfection of your creation? The image of God corresponds to its manifestation, i.e., such religious experience produces such an image. There is no better image anywhere in the world. For this reason, Buddha has placed the enlightened man higher than the highest Brahman gods. This most shocking defectuosity of the God image ought to be explained or understood. The nearest analogy to it is our experience of the unconscious. It is a psyche whose nature can only be described by paradoxes. It is personal as well as impersonal, moral and amoral, just and unjust, ethical and unethical, of cunning intelligence at the same time blind, immensely strong and extremely weak, etc. This is the psychic foundation that produces the raw material of our conceptual structures. The unconscious is a piece of nature our mind cannot comprehend. It can only sketch models of a possible and partial understanding. The result is most imperfect, although we pride ourselves on having penetrated the innermost secrets of nature. The real nature of the objects of human experience is still shrouded in darkness. The scientist cannot concede a higher intelligence to theology than to any other branch of human cognition. We know as little of a supreme being as of matter, but there is as little doubt of the existence of a supreme being as of matter. The world beyond is a reality, an experiential fact. We only don't understand it. Under these circumstances, it is permissible to assume that the summum bonum is so good, so high, so perfect, but so remote, it is entirely beyond our grasp. But it is equally permissible to assume that the ultimate reality is a being representing all the qualities of its creation: virtue, reason, intelligence, kindness, consciousness, and their opposites. To our mind, a complete paradox. The latter view fits the facts of human experience, whereas the former cannot explain away the obvious existence of evil and suffering. This age-old question is not answered unless you assume the existence of a supreme being who is in the main unconscious. This is why he was so popular among theologians. Such a model would explain why God has created a man gifted with consciousness and why he seeks his goal in him. In this, the Old Testament, the New Testament, and Buddhism agree. Master Eckhart said it: God is not blessed in his Godhead. He must be born in man forever. This is what happens in Job. The Creator sees himself through the eyes of man's consciousness. The Creator sees himself through the eyes of man's consciousness, and this is the reason why God had to become man, and why man is progressively gifted with the dangerous prerogative, and why man is progressively gifted with the dangerous prerogative of the divine mind. You have it in the saying, "Ye are gods," and that's from John 10:34. And man has not even begun yet to know himself. We would need it to be prepared to meet the dangers of the incarnatio continua, the continuing incarnation, which began with Christ and the distribution of the Holy Ghost to poor, almost unconscious beings. We are still looking back to the Pentecostal events in a dazed way instead of looking forward to the goal of the Spirit is leading us to. Therefore, mankind is wholly unprepared for the things to come. Man is compelled by divine forces to go forward to increasing consciousness and cognition, developing further and further away from his religious background because he does not understand it anymore. His religious teachers and leaders are still hypnotized by the beginnings of a then new eon of consciousness instead of understanding them and their implications. What one once called the Holy Ghost is an impelling force, creating wider consciousness and responsibility, and thus enriched cognition. The real history of the world seems to be the progressive incarnation of the deity. Here I must stop, although I should like to continue my argument. I feel tired, and that means something in old age. Thank you again for your kind letter. Yours sincerely, C.G. Jung. And this was 3 May 1958, so approximately 3 years before Dr. Jung died. Let's see. Okay. Okay, 100%. And I don't really know what it is you're trying to say here. If you're trying to fill the chat with nonsense, then I'm going to block you. But if you're trying to say something, please do say it. And I will respond to it. Okay, so I had a thought about next week, and I'm still interested in Alchemical Studies by C.G. Jung, volume 13 of the collected works, and I'm particularly interested in an essay called The Spirit Mercurius. And so my thought here is that I will read actually the conclusion of the summary of the Spirit Mercurius. Actually, let me begin by reading the beginning of the summary, and then I'll read the end of the summary. And then beginning next week, I'll start to work through the entire essay paragraph by paragraph. Dan says resistance to the organized mass can be affected only by the man who is as well organized in his individuality as the mass itself. Absolutely. No doubt about that. And part of this is about the issue that our friend Barbara raised the other day of raising up over the parapet. People don't often want to stand out. There's the old Japanese saying, the protruding nail gets hammered down. And I guess we can look at American politics and see who the protruding nail is right now. I'll leave it to you to make a judgment about who the protruding nail is. Maybe there's more than one. I might be one of them, of course. But ultimately, the mass will return to being a mass. So anyway, the summary of the Spirit Mercurius, and this is in paragraph 284, page 237 of volume 13 of the collected works. The multiple aspects of Mercurius may be summarized as follows. 1. Mercurius consists of all conceivable opposites. He is thus quite obviously a duality, but is named a unity in spite of the fact that his innumerable inner contradictions can dramatically fly apart into an equal number of disparate and apparently independent figures. 2, he is both material and spiritual. 3, he is the process by which the lower and material is transformed into the higher and spiritual, and vice versa. 4, he is the devil, a redeeming psychopomp, an evasive trickster, and God's reflection in physical nature. 5, he is also the reflection of a mystical experience of the artifacts that coincides with the opus alchemicum. 6, as such, he represents on the one hand the self, and on the other the individuation process, and, because of the limitless number of his names, also the collective unconscious. Now, I just mentioned that Mercurius, or Mercury, there used to be a statue of Mercury on the top of a building in downtown Rochester, New York. It was put away for many years, about 40 years, in storage. And finally, when I lived in Rochester in the early 1980s, late 1970s, they cleaned it up and put it back on the top of a building in downtown Rochester. And so let me just mention that the term adumbration means a vague foreshadowing. So now I will read from later in this summary. I'm reading starting with paragraph 300. Mercurius is an adumbration, that is a vague foreshadowing, of the primordial light bringer, who is never himself the light, but who brings the light of nature, the light of the moon and the stars, which fades before the new morning light. Of this light, St. Augustine, of this light, I never know whether it's Augustine or Augustine, but I usually say it Augustine. Of this light, St. Augustine says that it will never turn to darkness unless the Creator is abandoned by the love of his creatures. But this too belongs to the rhythm of day and night. As Holderlin says in Patmos, Patmos is the name of a Holderlin poem. And shamefully, a power wrests away the heart from us. For the heavenly each demands sacrifice, but if it should be withheld, never has that led to good. Paragraph 301. When all visible lights are extinguished, one finds, according to the words of the wise Vajnavalkya, the light of the self. What then is the light of man? Self is his light. It is by the light of the self that a man rests, goes forth, does his work, and returns. This is from one of the Upanishads, and it's mentioned by Hume in the 13 principal Upanishads. Okay, so the idea of self is obviously quite old because the Upanishads date back more than 2,000 years. So going back, I'll reread that last sentence. It is by the light of the self that a man rests, goes forth, does his work, and returns. Thus, with Augustine, the first day of creation begins with self-knowledge, cognitio sui ipsius, by which is meant a knowledge not of the ego, but of the self, that objective phenomenon of which the ego is the subject. Then, following the order of the days of creation in Genesis, comes knowledge of the firmament, of the earth, the sea, the plants, the stars, the animals of the water and air, and finally, on the sixth day, knowledge of land animals and of ipsius hominis, of man himself. The cognitio matutina is self-knowledge, but the cognitio vespertina is knowledge of man. And cognitio matutina, I believe, is knowledge of the morning or of youth, and cognitio vespertina is the knowledge of the evening or old age. As Augustine describes it, the cognitio matutina gradually grows old as it loses itself in the 10,000 things and finally comes to man, although one would expect this to have happened already with the onset of self-knowledge. But if this were true, Augustine's parable would have lost its meaning by contradicting itself. Such an obvious lapse cannot be ascribed to so gifted a man. His real meaning is that self-knowledge is the scientia creatoris, a morning light revealed after a night during which consciousness slumbered, wrapped in the darkness of the unconscious. But the knowledge arising from this first light finally and inevitably becomes the scientio hominis, the knowledge of man, who asks himself, who is it that knows and understands everything? Why, it is myself. That marks the coming of darkness, out of which arises the seventh day, the day of rest. But the rest of God signifies the rest of those who rest in God. The Sabbath is therefore the day on which man returns to God and receives anew the light of the cognitio matutina, and this day has no evening. From the symbological standpoint, it may not be without significance that Augustine from the symbological standpoint, it may be without significance that Augustine had in mind the pagan names of the days of the week. The growing darkness reaches its greatest intensity on the day of Venus, Friday, and changes into Lucifer on Saturday. On Saturn's day, Saturday heralds the light, which appears in full strength on Sunday. As I have shown, Mercurius is closely related not only to Venus, but more especially to Saturn, as Mercurius is Juvenus, as Saturn, Senex. Okay, so as Mercurius is Juvenus, as Saturn, Senex. Senex means old man. Okay, moving on. Paragraph 302, it seems to me that Augustine apprehended a great truth, namely that every spiritual truth gradually turns into something material, becoming no more than a tool in the hand of man. In consequence, man can hardly avoid seeing himself as a knower, yes, even as a creator, with boundless possibilities at his command. The alchemist was basically this sort of person, but much less so than modern man. An alchemist could still pray, quote, purge the horrible darknesses in our mind, unquote. But modern man is already so darkened that nothing beyond the light of his own intellect illuminates his world. Occasius Christi, Passio Christi. Sorry, I don't have the translation of that. That surely is why such strange things are happening to our much lauded civilization, more like a Gadameron than any normal twilight. I just point out that this essay was written and presented in 1942 at the Aeronaut Conference in Italy. It was rewritten and represented in 1948 and then published in English by the Psychology Club of New York in 1953. And here's the last paragraph, paragraph 303. Mercurius, that two-faced God, comes as the lumen naturae, the servitor and salvator, only to those whose reason strives toward the highest light ever received by man, and who do not trust exclusively in the cognitio vespertina. For those who are unmindful of this light, the lumen naturae turns into a perilous ignis fatuus, and the psychopomp into a diabolical seducer. Lucifer, who could have brought light, becomes the father of lies, whose voice in our time, supported by press and radio, revels in orgies of propaganda and leads untold millions to ruin. I'm just translating the Latin for you. Lumen naturae is the light of nature. Cognitio vespertina is the awareness of evening. And ignis fatuus is a wisp. So I'll just read that again after giving you those translations. Mercurius, that two-faced God, comes to the lumen naturae, the servitor and salvator, only to those whose reason strives toward the highest light ever received by man, and who do not trust exclusively to the cognitio vespertina. For those who are unmindful of this light, the lumen naturae turns into a perilous ignis fatuus, and the psychopomp into a diabolical seducer. Lucifer, who could have brought light, becomes the father of lies, whose voice in our time, supported by press and radio, revels in orgies of propaganda and leads untold millions to ruin. So I just point back to the to the definition of adumbration, which is vague foreshadowing, and I won't make further comment on what Dr. Jung was referring to, except to comment that he first gave this paper in 1942. So Dennis has got Dameron times for sure in the 1940s, absolutely. Lady Fairfax, hello. So anyway, that was just intended to tantalize you. That was only the sort of summary of the conclusion of this essay entitled The Spirit Mercurius. And what I propose to do is, beginning next week, go through the entire essay as I did The Secret of the Golden Flower. And The Spirit Mercurius, just to give you a sense of it, goes from page 192 to page 250, so it's 58 pages long. It's not quite as long as The Spirit of the Golden Flower, but in any case, that is my thought. I certainly will welcome any other thoughts anyone might have. If you have a better thought than me in terms of what we should discuss next week, I would be happy to hear it. As you know, if you are a member of our Dropbox, you have access to this essay, which is in volume 13 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And if you are not a member of our Dropbox, I urge you to send me an email to skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will make you a member of the Dropbox. And also, we run an advanced reading group on Tuesdays at 1:30 Eastern U.S. time, and I would welcome you to join that. In that conference, we are talking about Ion, which is one of Dr. Jung's rock'em sock'em books about Christianity, and also about the unconscious. We're currently about halfway through chapter 4, which is the chapter on the self, and the next chapter that we'll be discussing is chapter 5, which is Christ as a symbol of the self. And if you have not joined us originally, you can see all the earlier sessions in video form on our advanced reading group Dropbox, which is a separate Dropbox from the general Dropbox. So Gray says, is that essay in the collected works? Yes, Gray. It is in volume 13 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, which you can find in the Dropbox, and it begins on page 192, The Spirit Mercurius. Thomas says, appropriately, we are astrologically speaking about to enter a Mercury retrograde period in a couple of days. Oh God, what could possibly go wrong? I just every time I turn on my iPhone or the news, I go, oh my God, what are we doing here? So Gray says, Ion is horrifying, but chapter 5 is beautiful. Okay, well, I thought it was horrifying as well, because I have to say I read it originally about 10 years ago, and I just read through it, and I just could not grok what Dr. Jung was saying about Christ as a symbol of the self. I said, what is he talking about? This is the Son of God. I mean, I was brought up as a Christian, so we're talking about the Son of God, and Dr. Jung is talking about Christ as a symbol of the self. Well, finally, after much study and after trying to operate this reading group for the last 2 years, I've finally grokked what he was talking about. But I do acknowledge that it is horrifying, because it really points out to us some of the issues that are in Christianity. Now, I believe that Christianity will revivify itself by understanding what it was that Dr. Jung was talking about, because the archetypal aspects of the stories are still relevant. They're meaningful to us at a very deep level, at an unconscious level. And so when I go to church, I am sort of revivified by going to church, and how I'm revivified is a mystery, and it always has happened with me, and so I know that there is something there, but I understand now that it's coming through myself and through the unconscious. And I think the fundamental problem that we all have had is that Christianity for 2,000 years has been pointing up there for God, and Galileo found out how hard it is to say, oh, by the way, there's no God up there, and or yes, there is God up there, but it's not what you think. And the point I made last week is that Dr. Jung responded to Nietzsche's comment, God is dead, by establishing that God lives, where God lives, and how God goes about doing the business of the Godhead. That is a topic that we will discuss going forward, but anyway, such is my homily for today. Yes, the Word has to become flesh. That's absolutely true. And by flesh, it means in the experience of a living human being. You know, the Bible is all well and good and the most popular book ever written, but until it becomes flesh through you and through me, it has no meaning. It's nothing but words, as Joseph Fiennes says in Shakespeare in Love, words. He was very frustrated in that movie when he was trying to write one time, and that sort of sums up the frustration that I have now with the Logos and how it's being pushed upon us. So anyway, is there anything else that people would like to talk about? I'd be happy to answer any other questions or comments. I'm sort of out of things for today to talk about because I hadn't really prepared. I did want to make one comment going back to the early part of the chat here, which is yesterday Grenade had asked me, is personality dissociation synonymous to cognitive dissonance, or are you talking about pathological dissociation, identity disorder? What's the difference? Okay, well, that is beyond my pay grade. Okay, I'm not a mental health professional and I'm not a trained psychologist. And so those are really questions for people that are in those professions. My purpose here is only to bring forward the work of C.G. Jung and try to explain what I, as a layman, think he was talking about. I'm not saying I'm right. You can certainly disagree with me. I'm only saying that this is the way I interpret it and how I make it useful in my own life. So Lady Fairfax, yes, we are now live streaming every Monday evening at 8 p.m. And also for the advanced reading group, we're live streaming on Zoom every Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And for the advanced reading group, those videos are not available to the public. Those videos are in our Dropbox for the advanced reading group, so you can catch up if you've missed any. We started to talk about Ion about 8 weeks ago, so there's 8 weeks worth of video there in that Dropbox, and tomorrow we'll be at it again at 1:30. And so, okay, let's all take a little bit of a break tonight. And I was kind of struggling most of this afternoon because I couldn't get the sound on this video to match up, but I seem to have succeeded now, so I'm glad to see that, because that was a consternation and a frustration that took several hours to work out. And so 100% says Carl Jung touches my heart, and as it should be, because that's where he's aiming his work. He's aiming his work at experience and at eros, not at logos, which is dry and empty until you bring it into your own life. So anyway, have a great evening, everyone, and we will see you next week. Great to have you all with us tonight. And for the advanced group folks, I'll see you tomorrow at 1:30. And looking forward to that.